So, why do you need policies in your business and which ones do you need? This is the question I get most of the time from small business owners because most of them they have policies. They're written down somewhere. They're either in a handbook, a shared folder or intranet site, or printed out in a file drawer somewhere. And yet policies, they're still one of the biggest sources of confusion and questions. And that's not because the policies themselves are the problem. It's because we're not thinking about policies in the right way. In most cases, those policies that have been written are not being used. And they're not being used because they were not written for your business. So if policies do exist in your business, but they're not actually helping day-to-day decisions, it's time to take another look. It's likely they were written a while ago. They're probably pretty lofty, maybe written in complicated legalese from some template you found, or they're just too general, leaving a whole lot of room for interpretation and exceptions. But what I want you to do now is start thinking about your policies as your rules of engagement. They describe how work gets done in your business. So let me explain that a little bit more. Policies aren't meant to sit on a shelf, and they're not intended to be only used for compliance purposes. Policies are actually decision tools. They exist to help you respond consistently when something comes up, especially when things feel uncomfortable or maybe even a little emotional. If a policy isn't helping you make decisions, it's just not doing its job. Now, I think there's 3 reasons why policies break down in small businesses. Oftentimes, policies are written when the business is brand new, or it's written in the middle of or right after a really stressful situation. You know the ones where you immediately say, oh, we need a policy for this. Then they never get looked at again. But businesses change, people change, so policies need to keep up with that reality. The second reason policies tend to break down in a small business are that managers aren't confident using them. Even when policies exist, managers aren't always sure how to apply them because, again, they probably weren't written with your business in mind, and they're likely very overcomplicated. So managers hesitate, or they make exceptions, or they avoid the issue entirely. That's where inconsistency starts to creep in. The third reasons policies tend to break down for small businesses are that exceptions have become the norm. Flexibility matters in a small business. That's not the problem. But remember, policies are intended to tell the how you do business. But don't confuse that with rigidity. Just like with every rule, every policy will have an occasional exception. And in a later video, I'll take you through how to write a policy that has the right amount of flexibility so that you don't paint yourself in a corner. But when exceptions become the norm, policies just lose their meaning, and employees stop knowing what to expect or what to even trust. Now, every business will have different policies, but there's a handful that matter most and that I think most small businesses should have. And remember, when I say policies, I'm not talking about a big, massive handbook. I'm talking about a few core agreements between you and your employees. These are the policies that come up again and again, whether you've written it down or not. So why not write it down and be consistent? So number 1 is some sort of a code of conduct, how people are expected to show up in the business. Every business has a code of conduct, again, whether it's written or not. It's the expectations around respect, safety, customer interactions, or how people treat each other at work. It matters because it can give you language when behaviors feel off. Instead of thinking, I'll just leave this alone right now, it'll sort itself out, you can actually point to expectations. And that just protects everyone, especially when emotions are high. Now, the second policy I think almost all small businesses should consider is time away from work. How are you going to define that? What's allowed and how does it work? Because frankly, this is one of the biggest sources of frustration for both employees and managers. Not because managers and owners don't care, because the rules just might not be clear, especially if there's no written policy. Some of the common confusion comes up in questions like, can people just take time when they need to? Do they need approval? Is sick time different from vacation time? And I'm sure there's a million others you can think of. A usable time off policy answers those questions. It answers things like what time is actually available to the employees? how requests for time off should be made, and what happens when the business needs come first. Those are all things that a good policy will help you decide. Because remember, the most important use of a policy is to help you make consistent decisions. This isn't just about being rigid and never making an exception to your policy. It's about creating clarity and avoiding resentment and all of the other stuff that comes up when things like time off expectations are just not clear to anyone. And then the third policy I think every small business owner needs to consider is employee classifications, which basically identifies who's who and why it matters. Now, this one doesn't get a lot of attention until it becomes a problem because it is very much a compliance-related policy. This policy will define who is an employee versus a contractor. It'll define what roles are exempt versus non-exempt and how hourly versus salary compensation is handled. Now, this matters because it impacts really important things like pay and overtime, taxes, benefits, and even a degree of legal risk. So uncertainty here usually shows up as inconsistent pay practices, some really awkward conversations, and in the worst case scenario, some pretty expensive compliance issues. Another key point here is that clear employee classifications equals consistency as roles begin to evolve. And the last policy that I think every small business should consider is how pay decisions are made. And don't misunderstand me. Having a compensation policy does not mean that you're publishing everybody's pay. Instead, they explain how pay decisions get made. They'll cover topics that explain how you determine starting pay or raises, reviews, bonuses, and commissions if that's part of your business. And why this matters, it's because without it, pay feels very individual and personal to your employees, even when it's not. And when that happens, trust starts to erode. A compensation policy gives you language for tough conversations around pay. So how do you know if your policies are actually working? Well, there's a simple test that you can use. When an issue comes up, do you feel completely clear or more stuck? If a policy makes decisions feel easier, it's absolutely doing its job. If it creates more confusion, it needs some attention. So remember, policies don't need to be complicated to be effective either. They need to be current and they need to be actually used, meaning they're aligned to your business. And if you're not sure whether your policies are helping or hurting, I put together a simple checklist of 10 policies that most small businesses need. And you can get that in the link right below this video. And if there's a policy question you're wrestling with right now, leave it in the comments because I'm sure you're not the only one, and I'd be happy to do a video explaining. All right, that wraps up policies in this HR Basics series. Be sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next video. I'll see you then.